Hello and welcome to an international audience of some 350 people joining from around the world. My name is Hilary Boulding. I'm the president of Trinity College, Oxford, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a one-hour discussion hosted by Trinity College, featuring Rhodes scholars and Mayer Brown cybersecurity partners, David Simon, himself a Trinity alum, and Marcus Christian, an alumnus of St Anne's College, Oxford. Our moderator is Sadie Creese, Director of the Global Cyber Security Capacity Centre at the Oxford Martin School and Fellow of Worcester College, Oxford. During the next hour, our panelists will discuss ransomware and the broader cyber threat landscape. They'll lift the lid on what actually happens during the first week of an incident, and they'll touch on the impact on democracy, human rights, journalism, business, and indeed the wider public. Our speakers are supremely well placed to lead this discussion. David Simon is a partner at Mayer Brown Global Cybersecurity and Data Privacy and National Security Practices. He's a former Pentagon Special Counsel with extensive experience of advising victims of state-sponsored cyber activity. He counsels management teams and boards of directors as they respond to cyber incidents, as well as on the legal, regulatory, and reputational consequences. During his time at the US Department of Defense, David advised on cyber policy. He's advised the UN on cyber and international law and served as chief counsel to the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission that developed a comprehensive strategy to defend the US, including the private sector, from significant cyber attacks. David was a Rhodes Scholar, graduated from Harvard Law School, and read for an MPhil in International Relations at Trinity College, Oxford. He's joined by Marcus Christian, a partner in Mayer Brown's cybersecurity and data privacy practice in Washington, DC. Marcus is co-leader of the DC office's litigation and dispute resolution practice. He's recognized as one of the top data breach response lawyers. He was previously the executive assistant US attorney at the US Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. In this role, among other things, Marcus oversaw a number of identity theft task forces and supervised investigations and prosecutions of crimes related to data breaches. A Rhodes Scholar again, Marcus graduated from Yale Law School, and before that, read for an MSc in Education at St Anne's College, Oxford. Our moderator, Sadie Creese, is Professor of Cybersecurity in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Worcester College. Sadie is the founding director of the Global Cyber Security Capacity Centre at the Oxford Martin School, where she serves as co-director. She previously worked as a cybersecurity expert in business and as a research scientist specialising in security for the UK's Ministry of Defence. And it's a great privilege and pleasure to pass over to Sadie to moderate the session.
Thank you, Hilary, and welcome everybody. Over the course of this hour, I'll be in conversation with David and Marcus. And as Hilary said, we're going to hear from them about their perspective of the cyber threat landscape, how it's evolving, what role a cyber lawyer plays, what a cyber incident feels like in its initial stages and as it rolls out, and the lessons that their unique experience allows them to draw for organizations and indeed countries. And we'll close with a deep consideration of the potential implications of this evolving landscape for democracy, human rights, businesses, and the public at large. But before we get stuck in, and there's quite a lot to cover, I just wanted to remind you all that we would welcome your own questions. And in order to do that, please submit them using the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll try to address as many as we can, and we'll be doing that towards the end. So let's get started. David, Marcus, just kick us off. Could you both begin by providing a brief background as to how you came to work as cybersecurity and privacy lawyers, and your journey from Oxford to this profession. David, do you want to start?
Oh, it'd be my delight. Thank you, Sadie. And first off, I want to express our gratitude to you, Sadie, and to the Oxford Cyber Capacity Center, and then, of course, to Trinity College and Dame Hillary for welcoming us and for being with us today. We hope that you all joining us in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, enjoy this discussion. So in short, the journey from Oxford to cybersecurity at the time, and I think Marcus and I share this in common. We were interested, and I was very interested in a career in public service. And I was a student of geopolitics and had studied Russian and did a field research in Russia and China. And then eventually ended up serving the Obama administration later in my career, where I had the pleasure of working with a number of lawyers and operators, and as a consequence had exposure to cybersecurity. At that time, the Sony attack occurred by North Korea. And so that was my introduction formally, and then got into this from there.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you for having us. It's in some ways I chuckle when I think about going from Oxford to cybersecurity, because at the time when I was at Oxford, I hope I'm not dating myself, anyone who wanted to use email had to go to a special place at the university to actually sit down, and that's where I actually see a lot of Americans, because many of the people in Europe, from Europe or from the UK, weren't actually using email at the time. So as Ms. David mentioned, I spent a fair amount of time in public service, and before I joined Mayor Brown, probably about 15, 16, 17 years ago, I was a federal prosecutor, and someone came to me with an investigation of basically a cybercrime black market. At the time, the currency they were doing that was oftentimes used was something called e-gold, which is not used now. But at that moment, I was very fascinated with it. And at the time, I had already spent some time dealing with privacy and cyber issues, working for an educational nonprofit that provided scholarships to low-income children, and trying to figure out how do you deal with these problems. And so originally started dealing with the problems 20 years ago, started actually working at solving them for clients and to prosecute and enforce the law 15 to 17 years ago. So it's been fascinating, and it's always changing, and we get to help clients every day of the week.
Thank you. So often in the world of cybersecurity, we get the opportunity to talk with technical specialists, first responders, but it's a very unique lens that you have. I think as lawyers, you typically have such a privileged and close relationship with your clients. I really hope that we're going to get to see some deep learnings from you as we proceed. And I think we should just move quickly on. I mean, here we are, the year's 2022. There's been so much happening in the past 2 years through the pandemic. Can you really give us your insights into how you understand the threat landscape from your perspective? What major changes you've been observing in the past few years, and in your view, has the pandemic exacerbated the situation at all? I'm going to ask Marcus, do you want to start on that, please?
Absolutely. I'll begin with stating a proposition, and you can disagree with me if you like. Criminal actors like to make more money and like to not get caught, and cybercrime is a great vehicle for that. And so over the last few years, one of the things we've seen is cyber criminals have been able to have more impact and to make more money. And we see this with our clients, whereas some of them, and we have very sophisticated clients, weren't as worried. Some would say we don't have a lot of data that's regulated, so we're not worried about cybercrime. And then something called ransomware came along, and not just the small ransomware where someone had to pay a ransom of $500. I mean, ransomware where it would cripple a company. And then companies got more sophisticated and started backing up data. And then we got another form of ransomware in 2019, where they not only locked up data, encrypted data, they also exfiltrated it beforehand and said, if you don't pay this ransom, we're going to make this data publicly available. And then when companies wouldn't necessarily pay for that, they said, we'll exert more pressure on you. We'll take and hold your client's data hostage, and we'll go straight to them, or we'll go to regulators. We're going to do whatever we can to increase the pressure on you. And so it is always a game of greater impact, trying to make more money, and to not get caught, certainly, and cryptocurrencies help that. And with that, I'll turn over to David.
Well, just to reinforce what Marcus said, ransomware is certainly one of the top threats to any company, in addition to other cyber threats. But I will say that as for Marcus and myself, and for our practice of colleagues, across the firm, there's a number, about 80 of us in the firm. We have the privilege of helping victims of cyber attacks. I mean, we are often first responders. And for those of you who have thought about a career in public service, maybe thought about a career in law, this part of the conversation is something that is good to hew to, because at the end of the day, often we're called at the beginning, and we'll talk more about what that means. The ransomware threat is so real. It's really ransomware 2.0 in the United States, but also now increasingly in Europe. If you look at the news, ports, you see a number of different companies. We have to be careful about, obviously, the matters that we work on, but the consequences aren't just to the data, but also to the way that they are affecting infrastructure. And the threat actors are very aggressive, and they're rational economic actors, and they use double and triple extortion methods. I'll also just say that this has become a national security issue post the Colonial Pipeline attack. And as a consequence, governments are coming together. It's a topic at the G7. It's a topic in National Security Council meetings around the world. And as a consequence of this, there's more coordinated law enforcement work. And I think the question is this making a difference? And I think it's an interesting set of questions we can talk about. The other thing I'll say is that the pandemic, to your point, Sadie, has made a difference. The human element, whether witting or unwittingly, people make mistakes, and software is not often designed with security in mind. And as a consequence, often there is a person who makes a mistake, or may intentionally take data or give access, and we'll talk about what that might mean. But that's often a core area of risk as the perimeter moves to everyone's home machine in that zero trust environment.
And one other thing I just want to say is that, we thought before, and people said, cybercrime could actually impact lives and actually put lives at risk. At this point in time, be ransomware attacking a hospital, there's no doubt that cyber attacks have cost lives, and will continue to. So it's something to be taken very seriously, and to be dealt with proactively.
Thank you. And I think we're going to come back to that. But just move ourselves along a bit. This is for many people, I suspect they wouldn't have imagined to hear from lawyers that they're the first responders, the first port of call. And I think you've outlined for us, I would guess, the concerns that are at the forefront of the minds of the clients that retain cybersecurity specialist lawyers. But let's just delve into your role in an incident. What's the role of the lawyer if one of your clients is attacked? I'm going to go to David first for that, please.
Thank you, Sadie. As a lawyer, I would have initially thought that it would be simply, please give us your legal opinion. Tell us what you think the law is here, and we'll move along. But that's actually changed a lot for a variety of reasons, and I'll answer it this way. Although it can depend, and that's your typical legal answer, often Marcus and myself and our colleagues are brought in to really be the incident commander, to quarterback. We often are the first or one of the first calls. And because of not only our experience handling so many complicated incidents, whether they're national security or ransomware, cross-border and the like, or because of an understanding of the need to establish attorney-client privilege, it is increasingly common to have outside counsel play a role really leading all of it. In that regard, we can get the first phone call, and we're given the initial information. We triage that information, then bring in an expert. It could be a global leading cyber forensics firm, a firm that will do ransomware related investigation, threat actor engagement, and potentially payment of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency. E-discovery firms, all of these different cyber experts that you would think, well, these aren't lawyers. It's true. They're often retained by the outside counsel and acting at the direction of outside counsel, so that our clients have the benefit of the shield of attorney-client privilege, so they can make decisions and evaluate what they need to do with the benefit of confidence. And this model though it may seem less important than some of the operational impacts and costs, it has become the norm at a high level. And as a consequence, we are often playing that key role. It's not always the case. The last thing I'll say, and I'll turn it over to Marcus, is of course, in the course of an investigation, you discover that personal information may be impacted. So you have to notify authorities in Europe or the United States, or there's information that is relevant from a regulatory perspective, financial, regulatory, the like, or more broadly, there's multiple dimensions of the problem that taken together make it something that would be of national import. And so as counsel, we're often not only at the center of the storm, but the ones who are interfacing with law enforcement around the world, with national security agencies around the world, and preparing executives so that they can communicate effectively about this in a way that is candid, but also protecting the business of their customers and the like.
And I'd just like to highlight a few aspects of being an attorney, particularly one with experience in this area, what you bring to the table. One, by the nature of what we do, we as a litigator or other types of attorneys, you're used to coming into situations, you're trained to come into situations where you might not have a lot of expertise or a lot of knowledge about the facts, and to get up to speed quickly and to be able to make important decisions based upon that. For those of us who have been prosecutors and who have done hundreds and hundreds of investigations before coming to private practice, each of these incident responses, there are multiple aspects, and one of them is actually conduct an investigation, and doing that appropriately with the appropriate amount of discretion to be able to deal with multiple actors with various types of expertise, and have them work together as a team as a part of what we do, and also being used to dealing with serious consequences of various types. And I might add that David's not going to fool anyone into thinking he's an IT professional, and certainly I'm not as well. But after you deal with this years and years, you start to learn you learn some of the jargon and some of the other aspects of it, so that certainly more than the average person. I mean, imagine someone goes to get a computer science degree in 4 years. If I've been doing this 15 years or 20 years, and David's been doing it 10 years, we've seen a lot of this stuff, and so that's important. And we can also speak to the person who may be the first level witness in an organization, as well as speak to the folks in the C-suite because we deal with them, or speak to board members as necessary. So there are many aspects of this that I think are fit well with the skill set that lawyers, particularly experienced lawyers in this area, bring.
Thank you. What I want to do now is actually consider 2 or 3 threats that are likely to be on people's minds, and really bring to life the kinds of questions that you as the legal experts are going to put to them if they call you in to advise. So let's just start with ransomware, because it's on everybody's minds, and we've seen so many incidents, and it looks set to grow, doesn't it? I'm going to come to you first, David. Can you just talk us through what are the first questions that you as legal counsel are going to put to that client if they call you up and say they've been victim of one of these attacks?
That's a great question, Sadie. And I will tell you, this is increasingly common, but when a company believes that they've had a ransomware attack, where they believe that some of their systems are encrypted and they're down, they have a ransom note, the first questions are often really helping us get at the core, get our arms around the facts. And importantly, do they have backups? Okay. Are those available? How quickly can they restore them? And frankly, the harder question is, do they have the people and the know-how to do it themselves? Often the answer to that last question is not very good. Do they have cyber insurance that can drive whether there's an openness to considering payment and risk in the team they would bring? Another key question is, what are the operational impacts? Is this simply bringing down their internal email? Is it only affecting a certain set of systems, or could it be affecting their ability to deliver care to patients, to enable transportation system function? Are there health, safety, risks, and is there potential property damage? Some of these basic questions at the beginning. And often there's very little known. And of course, we'll ask, could we see the ransom note? Increasingly, these ransom notes, which do not contain that much helpful information, they will not in the initial instance say the amount of the ransom demand. But taking that information, we can then work closely with threat intelligence firms that we routinely collaborate with, and they will help us to figure out, to the best of our ability, based on anecdotal experience and data that's available, the likely threat actor group and their TTPs, their tactics, techniques, and procedures. And that's usually the beginning. Unfortunately, though, as Marcus underscored, often the basic answers to these questions are not stable. We often don't have perfect information, and we'll have individuals at a company who will say one thing with confidence, 99.9% confidence that this happened or that happened. I'm sure the data wasn't taken. We have no sensitive data. Often that turns out to be, not entirely correct. And so that's an important part of this, being able to navigate that and be confident that you will learn more as it unfolds.
Marcus, did you want to jump in at all?
Yeah, I mean, David pretty much covered it. Sometimes one of the most useful questions I can ask is at the beginning is, how did you learn about this, and how, and just trace that back, because given that we've seen so many of these, understanding how someone believes they learned about it can give you information that can be helpful in terms of investigation. So for example, it helps you understand how knowledgeable they think they are, if it's a new client, how sophisticated they are in this area, what's the level of communication about this so far, how far along are they, and a number of things, because clients, they come from various positions. Some may have a well thought out, well planned incident response plan, people trained. Some of them will not. Some of them we've worked with and helped plan for this. Some of them we have not. So we need to kind of understand the lay of the land, where they are now, so we can understand how best we can use those key precious moments at the beginning of an incident.
I just want to unpack, you mentioned the word preparedness, and it was on my mind also as David was speaking. Hearing from colleagues just this morning, reflecting on the fact that often when they go in and respond to these kinds of incidents, that the plans are not as well thought out as they really ought to be. And often clients perhaps haven't considered what a cyber disaster is going to look like for their organization. And in one of these attacks, if the systems are being taken offline, that can be quite disastrous. And I just wondered, is that your perception in terms of when you're working with clients? Do you have to spend a certain amount of time in advance of the bad days, just helping them to really think through how to be prepared, to be effective in the face of what actually turns out to be a very stressful experience?
So I would say, I like the way you say, do you have to? And we don't get the privilege oftentimes, or the luxury of being able to do it sometimes. So you can survive it if you haven't, but it's a world of difference if you have. And just give you an example, David talked about engaging companies underprivileged, such as a Mandiant or some other type of forensic company. If you haven't done that beforehand, that's going to take time. And in a ransomware attack, you're likely going to have multiple of these. And so if you haven't thought through that, that's going to take time. If you don't know who's a part of your team, that's another aspect that can slow it down. If we don't understand how your business works, what's important to you, which we try to do as lawyers try to do as a full service firm, you want to understand their business, what's important to them, so you can understand how this is impacting them much more quickly and much more clearly. But I'll let David add a few other points to that.
Yeah, I will say I obviously agree with what Marcus said. Speed is so important, and it's not always possible to know the facts quickly, but speed is critical. And there's really two kinds of companies: those that have had a devastating attack, often can be ransomware, and those that have not. And we work closely with clients to preparing playbooks, doing tabletop exercises. Frankly, a lot of the things that I learned from my time at the Pentagon, really developing concrete plans, procedures, muscle memory, and an operational mindset, not a policy that you'd fall asleep trying to read, but something that would make sense to you when you haven't slept well, and when you're on the phone with key players, with your board, and being able to communicate simply. But I also think that one thing that Marcus said is critical. So cyber is a team sport, and the team you might need that is perhaps not the team you know. So it's important to get to know who you would really use in the moment, and probably to have more than one, because when a ransomware attacks are hitting across the board, the team you want may not be available. I can tell you right now, given circumstances, I'm probably not in a position to take on 2 more significant incidents right now. And so the level of intensity in this space is I think, key. And often clients find themselves needing to bring on 4 or 5 new sets of firms to help them to manage through. So that's an important part of this puzzle.
And just one key question, right? We talk about people working remotely during the pandemic. Oftentimes, if you have done the legwork to have a plan, an incident response plan, where is it? Is it only in electronic form? Because if it is, you might not even be able to access it in the event of a ransomware attack. And just little things that experience and planning can help you to be ready for. And you multiply that 100 times or 1,000 times during the course of an incident. Preparation pays. And just to say, and speak in terms of money, some surveys suggest that companies that have a plan and that exercise the plan with tabletop exercises save on average around $2.5 million per incident. So
I wanted to ask the same question for 2 other kinds of threat, one being data breach, one being the issue of an information campaign against a company. But and I'm going to come to you both and ask you to reflect again on the key questions that you put to the clients, just so people can get a feel for how that might differ across different threats. But there is actually a really interesting question that's come out of our audience. And my guess is it doesn't pertain specifically to ransomware, but we're being asked whether you'd be willing to reflect on what is the line that we draw around defensive actions. So proactive defense, we might call this in the community. And where do you draw the line between something that would be considered an attack response yourselves and illegal, or an allowable, a legal active defense action? Now, my guess is that's not normally put at your desk in the context of ransomware, but certainly it's something that's considered, isn't it, in general. Did you want to comment on that right now? Could I come to one of you first, David, maybe?
Happy to. So what a wonderful question, and I see it came in the chat from former Secretary Jay Johnson, who I had the pleasure of working for in the Pentagon. So thank you for your good question. And also had the pleasure of traveling to Oxford some years ago. And I will not share any reflections on that time during this webinar. But I hope that anyone who's watching who knows about that will chuckle a little bit. I'll say, so the defensive action piece is very interesting. From the private sector perspective, and then I'll say something about in the government context, it can feel for a company that has been hit by a cyber attack like their job is to sort of take it. There's very little that they can do. The domestic law of most countries prohibits hacking back. There are a variety of reasons why it's difficult to engage in an operational manner with government, governments have authorities to respond. So what you really can do is prepare and have a good team and respond in a way that's consistent with your legal obligations, protect your customers and the like. That's challenging. I will say that we, and frankly, Marcus and myself and our colleagues have, I think, taken the step of trying to be innovative here and taken measures to try to deter threat actors through legal means, by suing threat actors, by obtaining injunctions in foreign courts, by basically increasing the cost to the attacker. And if we are able to do that, we can protect our clients, but also play an important role in reducing the risk. The other thing that we can do in the private sector and have done is working collaboratively with tech companies and government to target and bring down the infrastructure that they use in different countries. So those are some examples of things that law can allow you to do, things that you would imagine law enforcement would do, but often without having to coordinate with many government agencies, you can get a lot done because courts are more open to this than you'd expect. My guess is Marcus will comment more about this, but I say one thing about the government piece. So when I was in the Defense Department, and now we do advise in some contexts where this is relevant, whether it's defensive is often in the eye of the beholder. If there is an existing armed conflict, non-international or international, that can often be central to the framing. But I think that often it's not defined by cyber. So if you look at the situation in Ukraine right now, currently, though no government, I think, has said this openly, there arguably is a non-international armed conflict and an international armed conflict there. And so cyber actions taken by parties that believe that they are in that conflict could be regarded as defensive. So there is a lot to this that's highly technical. And my guess is that most countries that engage in these actions would probably characterize their actions as defensive in the first instance, if they acknowledge them at all.
So to pick up on a couple things that David said, one, in terms of taking creative legal actions, there was an incident, one of the first double extortion ransomware incidents that actually made headlines in late 2019. The threat actors were very aggressive about talking about what they do about the client, and this particular client said, you know what, if we can go and take down their name and shame website, let's go ahead and do it. And we used legal process to do that. The threat actors didn't like it. They went dark for several days and they made a lot of threats, and et cetera, et cetera. But the client, knowing that it wasn't going to be a permanent solution, still was ready to do that. So there are sometimes legal means you can do it. It's not going to be a game-ending move necessarily, but like David said, increasing the cost for the threat actors. And also I say it was, in many ways, a moral victory. Our client, in terms of a situation that had brought them negative publicity, received a lot of public publicity, and the number of calls that they received and we received asking about that approach. I mean, it was quite impressive. Now at the same time, we've sat in war rooms with clients who said, "Boy, I wish we could use technical means to take down their website." And so this is another reason why it's important to have a lawyer in the room, because we can explain how how that could be problematic on a number of levels. And one more thing is that sometimes there are facts that are unique, such that a client may have a window to do something technically that could be beneficial. So for example, let's say a threat actor made a mistake and somehow left a drive open where you can see where your data was stored temporarily. You don't want to just say, okay, I can see it, let me go grab it or delete it. But working with us and working with law enforcement, there may be ways to facilitate that. And so that's why it's important to have law enforcement, to engage with law enforcement, and know how to engage with law enforcement, as well as to have attorneys involved.
Actually, that really does bring us to another question we've had from the audience, which is actually on the issue of engaging with authorities. This is somebody who's worked in law enforcement, and they often reach a block when victims engage legal advisors, from their experience in the UK at least. So how can that kind of blockage be avoided? What's your perspective on that? How can you seem to be talking very positively about working in this kind of triangle of victim, legal counsel, and also authorities. So do you have a view on that kind of experience?
Go ahead, David, first, and I'll.
Sure. I'll just say, look, at the end of the day, cybersecurity is something that requires, information sharing. And currently, from the law enforcement's point of view, there's no legal obligation in most cases for companies to have to report something to law enforcement. There's a lot of guidance, there's a lot of recommendations. And so for law enforcement to be able to play their appropriate role, they need information. At the same time, our clients, when they're hit with an incident, one of the key questions that will be asked is, do we have to notify law enforcement? And usually the answer is no. And so the calculation is, what are the strategic objectives in engaging with law enforcement? And my experience with the FBI and NCA and law enforcement in other jurisdictions, there's an acute appreciation for this. And law enforcement can often provide invaluable intelligence about how other victims are experiencing. Sometimes they'll provide copies of malware and indicators of compromise. The cases where the law enforcement actually found a copy of our client's stolen data and provided that. That was enormously helpful to the client and to the victims. So there are a lot of ways that this can happen. I think the challenge is ensuring it's coordinated. And I do think that it depends on the lawyer you talk with. I mean, although many of the folks in our practice have worked in government, that doesn't mean that we're going to opening the door to everything the government wants. There's appropriate ways. In the UK, you can get protective orders that protect the identity of the client. We've been able to get orders in courts around the world without even having to identify in the court documents the name of the company, but we're able to nonetheless collaborate and comply with the law. So I think there are ways to do it, but I do think that there is a danger that you're going to be in for a penny, in for a pound. You'll be in a position to potentially lose control. I've had law enforcement agencies say, we'd like to receive that communication chain with a threat actor if it's a ransom negotiation. And by the way, we might decide to take over the communication on your behalf and not tell you. I mean, things like that are not helpful. So I think it really depends on it. And the key is to build that relationship in advance. And that's something that takes work and discretion.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on. I want to make sure we get to some of the really big implications discussion. But before we get there, I think there's just a couple more steps we need to take, because it's such a unique experience that you're sharing with everybody. Just want to step back. These initial questions that you put to clients when they come to you and they're experiencing an incident. We talked about ransomware in some detail. A couple others, I think, that will be on people's minds. One is the data breach, which we've already begun touching upon, especially in the context of proactive defense. The other one, though, is becoming very topical, is this issue of information campaign. And if people are saying things that, that are perceived to be causing your clients harms, without wanting to stray too long onto this, but what's your immediate response in terms of the questions? We heard about the questions that you would bring to your clients in the face of ransomware. What's your immediate concerns if somebody's talking to you about data breach, so loss of confidentiality of their secrets, or somebody appears to be conducting an information campaign against them? Is there anything different that you would advise or ask initially? I'm going to come to Marcus first. Marcus.
Well, one of the things is that data breach, a lot of it's two big parts of it. What type of information do we think that the threat actors have had access to, and two, how'd they get in? How'd they get in there? Are they still in there? So I guess that's three. Obviously the client's able to continue to operate if it's simply a data breach, but one of the critical questions is do you know? And many times if a client hasn't prepared, they don't know. And that can set you back significantly in an incident, not having an idea of the type of information. And the other thing is, I would say, is the reverse is oftentimes, especially years ago, people would get hyper focused on the question of, do I need to notify? And that's it. And is this going to go public? And the more important question is, if this is important information for you, what happens? What are the potential costs if it falls into the wrong hands? Obviously, if you're you have many trade secrets or a lot of important IT, those crown jewels can be devastating to lose them through a data breach. And so, those are some of the questions, but many of them are the same.
I just want to add one thing. One of the key experiences in government was knowing that we couldn't make decisions without good intelligence. We had to get good collection. The same thing is the case here. The attackers commonly know the victim better than the victim knows itself. So one of the first things we say is, look, what is our visibility into the environment, into the different systems, the endpoints? And before we tell anyone what we think the situation is, we need to be clear and say, what's our percentage visibility? And if it's 0%, then we have very little confidence in anything we're going to say next. And often it takes a few weeks with a level of technology the company doesn't have to get to something like 80% visibility. And so that informs what's our low, medium, high confidence. In the conclusions are often shared in meetings. And I think that was a lesson I learned from working with the intelligence community. And I think it has been useful in the context where often cyber hands will say, this is exactly what happened. This did not happen. Well, the question is, what's your visibility? And often clients don't have that visibility to begin with.
And I can underscore that just in terms of working with agents. When you have an investigation that comes to you, be it, classified or otherwise, from my vantage point, the information that's brought to you in agent reports is very different from the information you learn when you dig deeper and you deal with the witnesses firsthand, et cetera, et cetera. So understand, getting as much information as you can, not taking anything for granted, don't take anything at face value, and moving quickly.
Mm-hmm. We have a question that I'm going to put to you right now from the audience, which is, what's the usual time frame between the hack occurring and the victim finding out about it? And can you accelerate that finding out that you've been attacked? Did anyone want to jump in on that? Marcus?
Yeah, well, one of the questions you asked earlier was how's it changed over 5 years? One, I'd say the amount of time generally has gone down, right? We were talking about the better part of a year if you 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and now that amount of time has come down. But it's not the same for everyone. Those who are better prepared are more likely to know. And if you have, and David asked a question about visibility. If you have endpoint protection, certain types of endpoint protection are going to be give you information very early on of anomalies. Even if some of the best threat actors, they can't get in necessarily and be completely invisible because they will create anomalies. And having not only the data being detected by that endpoint protection, but also having someone to interpret it. Because I've seen incidents where clients had great protection, but no one was looking at it, no one was digesting it, and so they were just flipping the switch off when alerts came about, and there they were with having a threat actor there 2 months, for 2 months without any actions taken to deal with it.
It's a really, really big problem. Let's move on to accountability. You were talking earlier about how actually the legal profession and the clients, I guess, working together, you can kind of collaborate to act as deterrents, to hold threat actors to account, to try and increase the work factor, as they say, and to make this crime not pay, I guess. But let's just reflect a bit more on accountability. Is it, in general, is it even possible to charge these threat actors, or are they too amorphous? I'm going to come to Marcus first on that.
Well, I'll say, putting on the hat of a former law enforcement person, the rate of charging these threat actors is very low, but that doesn't mean that people are without options. First of all, and that gets partly to dealing with working with law enforcement. Even if they can't solve an incident right now, they take the intelligence and they put together it's a puzzle. They put together the pieces, and over time it helps them. And I can touch the early double extortion ransomware attack that I talked about before. There's nothing in the papers about anyone being caught, and maybe no one will ever be caught, but we don't know. There could be charges that are under seal. Sometimes these threat actors are caught when they try to travel from places where they can't be, from which they can't be extradited, to places where they can, and all of a sudden, surprise, there's a warrant out for your arrest, and we're going to bring you to the United States. And so, and the other thing is, and I underscore this with David because he calls me an old man. If we're ever out at night walking, I don't have to be able to beat the person who attacks us. I just have to be able to outrun David, and that's why I work out every day. And so, as a business, you want to have the best protection you can, because the threat actors use certain types of attacks. They like to use phishing. They like to use, they like to find remote open access. They like to find shared credentials. They like to find certain things that, if you are an easy target, you're most likely going to be the ones that are caught. If you're a more difficult target, unless they have a specific reason for coming after you, they're likely to move on. David?
Yeah, I think that's all right. I mean, at the end of the day, there's chronic vulnerability, and even sophisticated threat actors start with very, very basic tools, so they don't burn their greatest tools to get in, and that's usually enough.
Yeah, of course. And I'm going to ask you another question from our audience, because it's incredibly pertinent. And somebody's asked, what's the best training you've seen for everyone at the company to reduce the risk? And this really goes to, how can you make yourself less vulnerable? Just quickly, because I know we've got a lot to get through, but is there anything either one of you wants to offer our audience in terms of what's the gold standard in training to try and reduce your vulnerability to these kinds of things?
Just a quick take is, of course, doing exercising. So tabletop exercises are common, and it's expected like annually, but I think it's doing it at the executive level, the board level, the mid level, the teams, and doing it with the team you would actually use in the incident. That's pretty unusual. Next level is across sector with suppliers that you would rely upon. To be frank, most companies below a certain threshold really aren't doing this. And so at the level they need to, or they're not paying enough attention. And then, of course, thinking about different scenarios and planning. But there's I think a great thing is when a small incident happens, if the client takes it really seriously, that can often be the best opportunity to learn.
And then,
right.
Yeah. And
Okay.
the anti-phishing training is very important. To get a cross section of your employees, to make them more vigilant, to make them more critical when they receive the email message that has this great opportunity for them. They just need to click immediately. And non-training aspect of it is multi-factor authentication. That's one of the number one. That's probably the number one thing that clients who've been hit wind up implementing after the fact.
Thank you. That's great insight. And David, I love the metaphor of the immune system. So let's expose ourselves to some of these things. It's very topical. Gentlemen, I want to move us on now and broaden out in this final quarter of an hour and really think about the potential wider implications of these evolving cyber threats. Because we know, don't we, that they have significant consequence, really. Not that our businesses aren't important, but for society at large more broadly. So, Marcus, I'm going to come to you first on the topic of democracy. What do you think about the risks to democracy in this cyber landscape that we're living? What sort of threat vectors come to mind? And to what degree do you believe people really ought to be concerned about the issue of hacking democracy, as we've heard it coined? Over to you, Marcus.
So we'll talk about this for the next 2-3 days. But obviously they're great concerns. We've seen it play out over the last 2 elections. Just give an example of key people involved in democracy, people who are necessarily perhaps seeking office, people who may be reporting about elections, having their personal files, their email accounts and other accounts hacked, and having information disclosed that, one, could ruin their reputations, 2, could put them in danger, and you see this happen over and over again. So it can be, 1, a disincentive, 2, it can actually sway what's going on in elections. I mean, the idea of servers, public servers, private servers, obviously were key themes in our last election. Depending upon where you're talking about democracy and efforts for democracy, you have obviously foreign threat actors, nation states that are interfering in elections, that are there's a lower level of confidence when you think that people are concerned about whether their voting machines can be hacked. I could go on for days talking about this, but it's inexorably intertwined with democracy, because technology is a part of who we are and what we are. And I'm going to turn it over to David, because I have a fear that I'm going to talk too long on this, because it's something that we see every day, and I feel very strongly about.
I'll just say one thing very briefly, which is that, hacking democracy and this topic of information operations, trust in our institutions are so bound together. And if we look around the world, from the United States to the UK to Poland to Ukraine right now, this is a dire situation. Access to information, access to technology, integrity of information, and going back to this idea of visibility and confidence that the information we're accessing is what we believe it to be. It's eroding our confidence in institutions, and cyber space and cyber tools are playing a role in that is both helpful but also harmful.
Yeah, and you talk about cybersecurity, right? Confidentiality is the thing that jumps out, right? What I talked about in terms of hacking emails, but that integrity of the information you're seeing or that you have access to is very important, as well as the availability of good information. And one thing that the specter of came out last time is the whole idea of deep fakes, right? If you're a candidate, someone could misrepresent what you're saying, what you've said, in a way that is very convincing. And how do we deal with that?
Yeah, and it's such an important discussion that we're all beginning to have, because actually discussion is at the center of democracy, is it not? But this issue of deep fakes, it can't be too far in the future where we see that at the heart of some ransomware attacks on leaders of businesses, and that there's some convergence, isn't there, between some of the challenges that we're going to face in our organizations, and exactly the same techniques and challenges being deployed at a much different scale that's affecting the heart of our societies and democracies, but not actually just democratic ways of governing in general, I would think. Let's touch on another topic, that of human rights. So lots of us believe there's a strong connection between cybersecurity and protecting human rights. But perhaps, David, do you want to start for the benefit of this session today by explaining, in your view, from the legal perspective, what's the connection between cybersecurity and human rights?
Sadie, thank you so much for asking. This is a really important question. And I think it's really, there's an obvious answer at first. Oh, there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, basic rights and freedoms, protection of vulnerable people, and how do cyber attacks affect them? But I think that it's important for us to look behind the story in the news. You know, what is the story behind the story? When we think about the hack and blackout, for example, in December of 2015 in Ukraine, or in Ingushetia, or look around the world where the internet is shut off, what are the implications for people that we're not reading about, particularly in places in the world where there's not a free press? You know, if the energy's out and it's winter in Ukraine, what does that mean for hospitals? What does that mean for people living in elderly care centers or in orphanages? I mean, now take a circumstance, for example, in Syria, during the context of an armed conflict there. How is cyber being used in a way that is undermining the ability for people to get essential services? These can be regarded as, not only human rights violations, but in some contexts, potentially war crimes against humanity. And the International Criminal Court is currently thinking about this, in the context of conflicts where cyber has been very actively used. So I think that's important. Another aspect is this, cyber weapons or cyber means, seem like a relatively new thing, but really 99% of a cyber attack is espionage, collection, access activity, which is, espionage is really as old as armies. And these sort of tools, which are now technology enabled and privatized, have been used in the war context, but also in a context by states and non-state actors to target the very people who protect human rights advocates, and journalists, who I think do such an important part in this regard. And if those tools, espionage tools, are used to intercept the communications, to spy on and surveil for malicious players, those very journalists and human rights activists, that we've seen how that surveillance can lead to serious consequences. For example, the extraordinary dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, journalists around the world who are surveilled. And this, I think, it's an important part of the discussion around cybersecurity, not the effect itself, but the use of cyber-enabled means to undermine human rights protections, particularly places where that repression is widespread.
Marcus, did you want to add anything to that?
I think of, and this is, I think of a law partner of mine, right? So a person who has means, who's sophisticated, going to a country, I'm not going to mention the country's name, taking a photo of the smog. And everything was fine until my colleague decided to send an email to someone attaching the photo and making a comment on how dirty it was. All of a sudden, those images disappeared from her phone. Imagine if she were talking about human rights abuses or trying to make any headway against a repressive government. Imagine what the consequences could have been for her. Fortunately, she's a person of means. She was leaving the country. She will never, she was able to get a new device, but you multiply that, and she wasn't a person of interest as far as I know. It really is, it's troubling.
Yeah, and journalism, we know, and our ability to observe what's happening around us and to scrutinize it and to really consider it becomes incredibly important. Are there other implications? We've dealt with democracy. We've talked about human rights. We've touched upon the connection of journalism, but let's return back to businesses and consumers. How do we consider the implications of this cyber threat landscape and how it's evolving for them? How do we see the future unraveling? How do you see harms building from your legal perspective and your experiences? How do you even understand the costs to business in the future from cyber attack? Marcus, did you want to start on that?
Yeah, so the word that comes to mind is just pervasive, and I hate to say it, but it affects all of us. And David and I oftentimes we're talking about this. We talk about a cyber tax, right? The tax, everything we do is more expensive because we have to deal with this issue, and it's some of us, we pay it because we spend more time preparing for it. We have more protections. We use VPNs. Some of us pay for it because we don't use these things and we lose data or some combination thereof. The usefulness of the tools we have that are really cutting edge and when I was a child could not have imagined, they're less useful. We have to take precautions. We have to think twice before we can say, is that email from David or from Sadie, before we do something and interact with it. And then you multiply. You look at our institutions are dealing with that. Those of us who've had background checks when there was the hack, on the government, and all of our information is taken. We have to think about all those things. We have to deal with all of those issues. And we don't have a good solution. And it'd be nice to say, well, we're thinking about it now, so we're going to have a solution. But these questions we didn't start asking them 10 years ago or 20 years ago. There were government reports dealing with these 40, 50 years ago. And so we're not going to find a quick solution. And it's going to take, for this pervasive problem, it's going to take a widespread approach that calls on all of us to act and calls on consumers and to a person to be more educated, to be better. It needs to be a way of life.
I would just add, this kind of comes back full circle to many of the things my guess is that both of us were studying at our own times at Oxford. The question of what are the most consequential challenges that we can tackle. And I think that in the world of cybersecurity, and as we think about the effect on businesses, it's exactly what Marcus said. Whenever we see a headline about the number of people's data who was stolen, my data has been stolen 5 or 6 times that I'm aware of, at least, all of these big headlines. What there was in the headlines recently that News Corp, which is Fox News and Wall Street Journal, was compromised by some sophisticated threat actor. Every day you see more. And it's easy to focus on these numbers. But I think at the end of the day, it's what Marcus said. There is this really consolidated cumulative impact. It is a tax, TAX, on all of us. It is something that we should be able to assess, and it is affecting how everyone lives. And it's one thing to talk about it as an economist, which I'm not, but I think that we can all appreciate that it is affecting how we trust each other, trust technology. Some of this technology can be life-saving. Why should we be worried about those trade-offs when we could think more about security? A trust in our institutions, like the ones that we go and vote in. Imagine in a budding democracy to be worried about this, to have the opportunity to vote for the first time and not be sure if the information you have is right. And then lastly, I think it has a really terrible effect on our social fabric. And so this is not meant to end on a negative note, but I think that it is acknowledging that this set of issues, it quickly kind of cuts to the core of how technology and society have to be reconciled. And there's a lot of work to be done. And, being a first responder and assisting companies is part of the puzzle. But this is a broader issue that I think needs to be taken up well beyond the realm of pure technology and law.
Marcus, I'm going to come to you for what is almost the last word.
Yeah. So
anything you would like to leave the session today and communicate to our audience as being a key insight you'd like them to have at the forefront of their mind, or even some tools or actions that you think governments and the international community really need to prioritize if we're going to address this threat?
So I think this needs to be an ongoing topic, needs to be prioritized in terms of we need to be working to find solutions, not and to a person. I want to talk about an individual level. There used to be a time when most colleges used to require everyone to know how to swim. Those tests have gone away, and fortunately I was able to graduate from college not being a good swimmer. But now someone asked me what's the one thing they should teach. We need to learn how to be citizens in a world where cybersecurity is a challenge. We need to all learn how to protect ourselves, how to protect our institutions, and how to be, when we vote, when we go to the ballot box, we need to understand not only what people are going to do about taxes and how they're going to put food on the table. Can they help protect us? Can they help find good solutions? This is in our minds the biggest issue we're going to have to deal with.
Thank you. So it's really a call to action. We might call it cyber fitness, we might call it cyber awareness, but cyber citizenship at all levels. We're at time, gentlemen, so I'm going to have to thank you very much to Marcus and David. to Mayor Brown, to colleagues of the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre and the President of Trinity College, and most importantly, to all of our attendees. It's been really, really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.